It was the spring of 1943, and the war in Europe had reached a fever pitch. Across the grey skies of England, the airfields of the United States Army Air Forces were alive with noise and purpose, the roar of engines, the whine of propellers, the scent of fuel and oil thick in the air. The 56th Fighter Group was among them, a band of American airmen whose courage and ferocity would soon become legend. Their mounts were the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, massive, ironclad beasts of the sky, not sleek like a Spitfire nor agile like a Messerschmitt, but built with the heart of a prizefighter. The pilots called her the Jug, short for the Juggernaut, and for good reason. The P-47 was a brute, heavy, slow to climb, but devastating in a dive and unmatched in toughness. With 8.50 caliber machine guns in her wings and a Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine capable of over 2,000 horsepower, she could take punishment that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. She was the perfect companion for men like Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th, a man as sharp and unyielding as the aircraft he led. Zemke was no ordinary officer. He had studied the enemy's tactics, learned from the failures of others, and forged his group into an instrument of precision and aggression. Under his command, the 56th became known as Zemke's Wolf Pack, a name that fit their style: disciplined, coordinated, and deadly. Every pilot under Zemke's watch knew that survival depended not just on skill, but on teamwork. His methods were unorthodox by some standards. He trained his men to think like predators, to work in pairs, to attack with cunning and to disengage before the enemy could trap them. And in the months leading up to that fateful mission, the Wolfpack honed their craft in the bitter skies over France and the Low Countries. The enemy they faced was no mere adversary. The Luftwaffe's fighter wings, the Jagdgeschwader, were composed of battle-hardened veterans. Pilots of Jagdgeschwader II Richthofen and Jagdgeschwader 26 Schlageter had fought since the Battle of Britain and claimed hundreds of kills. They flew the formidable Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt Bf 109, nimble, lethal aircraft in the hands of men who had learned to survive against impossible odds. Among them were aces like Oberleutnant Egon Meyer, Major Joseph Priller, and Lieutenant Siegfried Schnell, names whispered among Allied pilots with a mixture of respect and dread. These were men who knew the sky as intimately as a sailor knows the sea, and their skill had carved deep scars into the daylight offensive of the 8th Air Force. Each bombing raid the American sent into occupied Europe met swarms of interceptors rising to tear them apart. The B-17s and B-24s, the flying fortresses and liberators, needed protection, and the P-47s of the 56th were tasked to provide it. But the Thunderbolt's limited range meant the escorts could only stay with the bombers for part of the journey, leaving them exposed deep in enemy territory. It was a problem that haunted Allied command, and it made every mission a gamble. Yet Zemke's men didn't flinch. They took off day after day, pushing their aircraft to the edge of their endurance, knowing full well that many would not return. The morning of the Abbeville mission began like so many others, cold, damp, and shrouded in mist. At first light, the mechanics were already at work, tuning engines, loading ammunition, and checking every line and cable. The pilots gathered in the briefing room, where a haze of cigarette smoke curled beneath the low ceiling. Maps were pinned to the wall, red strings tracing routes across the channel to targets deep in occupied France. The briefing officer outlined the mission: a sweep ahead of the bombers, a fighter sweep designed to draw the Luftwaffe into battle before the bomber stream arrived. The target area, Abbeville, home to one of the Luftwaffe's forward fighter bases. Reconnaissance photos had shown dozens of aircraft parked in revetments, and intelligence suggested the presence of Jagdgeschwader 26. For Zemke's Wolf Pack, it was a challenge they relished. They would strike fast and hard, dive through the enemy's airspace like a blade through fabric, and disappear before the Germans could react. But the men knew better than to underestimate the enemy. Every pilot in that room had seen comrades shot down, had watched burning aircraft fall into the sea, had written letters to families who would never see their sons again. War had stripped away the illusions of glory. What remained was duty, and the bond between men who flew together and fought for one another. As the pilots left the briefing, the tension shifted into focus. They donned their gear, flight suits, Mae Wests, parachutes, and climbed into the cockpits of their Thunderbolts. Ground crews gave thumbs up, engines roared to life, and the field trembled as the formation rolled out for takeoff. One by one, the P-47 surged down the runway, lifting into the grey morning sky, the howl of their turbo-superchargers echoing like distant thunder. The flight climbed through low clouds, the English coastline slipping away beneath them, and soon the wide expanse of the Channel spread out like a sheet of cold steel. For many of these men, it was a familiar crossing, a journey from the relative safety of England into the deadly ballet of air combat over enemy territory. There was no conversation now, only the steady hum of the engine, the rattle of oxygen masks, and the flicker of instruments dancing in the dim light of the cockpit. The squadron flew in tight formation, Zemke at the front, his eye scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Below them, the world looked serene, rivers and fields, the faint trace of roads winding through the countryside, but every pilot knew that somewhere beyond that peaceful surface, German radar stations were already tracking their every move. Within minutes, the Luftwaffe's warning network was alive. Along the coast of France, controllers at airfields like Abbeville, Saint-Omer, and Lille were relaying reports to the WWII command posts. Pilots scrambled to their aircraft, mechanics pulled away wheel chocks, and engines coughed to life in bursts of smoke and flame. The alarm sirens howled, and the once quiet airfields transformed into hives of activity. Oberleutnant Egon Meyer of JG2 was among the first to respond. A seasoned ace with over 60 victories, Meyer knew the sound of the sirens meant business. The Americans were coming again, and it was his duty to meet them. In his Focke-Wulf 190AR5, he taxied to the runway, lined up, and pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft leapt down the strip and climbed into the sky, joining his Staffel in a climbing spiral toward the intruders. At Abbeville itself, elements of JG-26 scrambled as well. Major Joseph Pips Priller, the famed commander of 3 JG-26, was already airborne with his wingman, scanning the northern approaches. The Luftwaffe had been blooded, but it was far from broken. These were no amateurs, they were veterans fighting for their homeland, and they knew the terrain, the weather, and the tactics of their opponents intimately. The Americans, bold and determined though they were still learning the deadly chess of air combat over Europe. As the two forces hurtled toward one another, the stage was set for one of the fiercest clashes of the air war. The sky above northern France was deceptively calm, a pale blue canvas streaked with thin clouds, but within minutes it would erupt into chaos. Zemke's formation leveled off at altitude, the P-47s glinting in the sunlight, each pilot tightening his grip on the control stick as the radio crackled with brief bursts of coded chatter. They were approaching enemy territory, and the tension in every cockpit was a living thing, coiled tight and waiting to strike. The Wolfpack's mission was simple on paper: engage and destroy any Luftwaffe fighters before they could reach the bomber stream. In practice, it meant diving headlong into the jaws of the most disciplined air defense network in Europe. Zemke glanced down at his instruments, then out toward his wingmen. To his right flew Major Gabreski, already a rising star and a natural-born hunter. Francis Gaby Gabreski had an instinct for air combat, a sixth sense that told him when the enemy was near. He was calm now, his eyes hidden behind his goggles, scanning the vast expanse of sky ahead. To his left was Robert Johnson, quiet and steady, a man whose nerves of steel would soon make him one of the top aces of the war. Behind them, the rest of the group held formation like a flock of armored hawks, engines humming in synchronized defiance. They crossed the French coast near Le Touquet, and almost immediately, ground fire began to rise from the fields below, black puffs of flak bursting around them, fragments whipping past like hornets. The pilots held their course. Flak was frightening, but it was impersonal. The real danger was the enemy fighters that were even now climbing to intercept. Then, high above and to the east, movement, sunlight flashing off wings. Zemke's voice cut through the static: bandits, 12 o'clock high. The formation tightened. The Germans were coming. A dozen Focke-Wulf 190s dove out of the sun, their radial engines howling, guns already blazing. Tracers stitched across the sky as the two formations met in a violent convergence of speed and fire. The first pass was a blur, flashes of metal, the scream of engines, the rattle of gunfire. A Thunderbolt burst into flame and spiraled down, its pilot bailing out just before the aircraft exploded against the fields below. Another German fighter disintegrated under a burst from Gabreski's guns, pieces of fuselage tumbling through the air. The sky became a swirling arena of death. There was no formation now, only instinct: dive, roll, shoot, climb, repeat. Zemke's voice barked short commands over the radio, trying to maintain some semblance of order. "Keep your pairs. Watch your six." But the fight had fractured into dozens of deadly duels. Johnson found himself pursued by a Focke-Wulf, cannon shells bursting around his cockpit. He threw the heavy jug into a dive, the altimeter spinning wildly as he plummeted toward the deck. The German followed, confident his lighter aircraft would close the gap. But Johnson knew the P-47's secret: in a dive, it was unmatched. He held steady, letting the airspeed build past 500 miles per hour, the controls shuddering under his grip. The pursuing Focke-Wulf couldn't follow, its wings began to buffet violently, and the pilot broke off. Johnson pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing him into his seat. He leveled out low over the countryside, heart pounding, and scanned the sky for another target. Above him, the battle raged on. Gabreski, always aggressive, had already downed one enemy and was chasing another through a patch of thin cloud. His target jinked left and right, but Gabby stayed glued to him, firing short, controlled bursts until the German's engine erupted in smoke. The Focke-Wulf rolled inverted and plunged toward the earth, disappearing into a plume of dust. Gabreski didn't linger to watch, he climbed back to altitude, looking for Zemke's flight. The radio was alive with frantic calls, pilots calling out kills, others shouting for help, some voices cut off mid-sentence. It was chaos, pure and unfiltered, the kind of fight that left no room for thought. Every movement, every trigger pull, came from instinct and training. In the middle of it all, Zemke fought like a man possessed. He engaged a pair of Messerschmitts that had slipped in from above, firing long bursts that ripped into one and sent it spinning down in flames. The other tried to climb away, but Zemke chased it, his Thunderbolt roaring as he closed the gap. The German pilot twisted and dove, but the heavy jug stayed with him. At 500 yards, Zemke fired again, and the 109 exploded in mid-air, pieces scattering like burning confetti. But victory came at a price. The 56th was taking losses. One by one, pilots called out damage or silence filled their channels. Lieutenant William Bill Bailey's engine was hit, smoke poured from the cowling as he struggled to keep control. "I'm hit, I'm bailing," he shouted, his voice calm despite the flames licking at his canopy. He pulled the release, the canopy blew off, and a moment later his parachute blossomed against the sky. Below, German troops on the ground watched the dogfight unfold, tracers arcing across the heavens. Farmers ran for cover as aircraft crashed into fields, leaving craters of burning metal. It was over in minutes, though it felt like eternity to the men inside it. As suddenly as it had begun, the sky cleared. The remaining Luftwaffe fighters broke off, diving away toward their bases. Zemke regrouped what was left of his formation. "Wolfpack, form up. Let's go home." His voice was steady, but inside he knew the cost. The group had lost several pilots, others were missing. Yet they had destroyed more than a dozen enemy aircraft. It was a brutal exchange, but one that tilted slightly in their favor. The battered formation turned westward, climbing back toward the safety of the channel. Smoke trailed from a few damaged aircraft, but they stayed together, limping home as a single unit. As they crossed the coastline, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by exhaustion. The pilots barely spoke. The silence over the radio was heavy, filled with the unspoken tally of who was missing. By the time they reached England, the fuel gauges were near empty. The first P-47s touched down at their base, tires screeching, engines coughing as they rolled to a stop. Ground crews rushed to meet them, counting the planes, scanning the sky for stragglers who would never return. Zemke climbed out of his cockpit, his face streaked with sweat and grime. He removed his oxygen mask, looked around the field, and silently acknowledged the empty spaces where his men should have been. Gabreski landed a few minutes later, taxied in, and shut down his engine. He climbed out, met Zemke's eyes, and gave a small nod, the gesture of men who had seen too much but would keep going anyway. The debriefing was somber. Intelligence officers recorded claims, mechanics assessed damage, and the surviving pilots tried to piece together what had happened. The tally was grim, several Thunderbolts lost, but the Luftwaffe had suffered heavily too. The Germans had thrown some of their best units into the fight, and they had paid for it. For the Wolfpack, it was both a victory and a lesson. They had tested themselves against the elite of the Luftwaffe and held their own. Zemke sat in the operations room long after the others had gone, staring at the mission map. Red pins marked the points of engagement, the last known positions of his missing men. War, he thought, was not about glory. It was about endurance, about fighting again tomorrow, and the day after, until the job was done. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the field. The mechanics were already preparing the aircraft for the next mission, wiping oil from their hands, loading new belts of ammunition. The Wolfpack would fly again. Across the Channel, in occupied France, the German pilots were making their own tallies. At Abbeville, Major Priller debriefed his men, noting the loss of several experienced comrades. Egon Meyer returned grim-faced, knowing that the Americans were getting stronger with each encounter. The Luftwaffe's dominance, once absolute, was beginning to erode under the relentless pressure of Allied industry and manpower. In mess halls and barracks, the talk was of fatigue and attrition. The German aces still fought with skill and fury, but their replacements were younger, less trained, and fewer in number. For every veteran lost, the gap grew wider. The battle over Abbeville was only one of countless clashes that marked that brutal year, but for the men of the 56th Fighter Group, it became a defining moment, proof that they could stand toe-to-toe with the Luftwaffe and survive. The war was far from over, and greater challenges lay ahead, but that day, in the skies above northern France, Zemke's Wolfpack had earned its name in full. The weeks following the battle over Abbeville were a blur of activity and preparation. The air war did not pause for grief, losses were acknowledged, replacements arrived, and missions continued. At the 56th Fighter Group's base, the runways echoed with the constant rhythm of takeoffs and landings, engines roaring from dawn until dusk. The mechanics worked without rest, patching bullet holes, replacing damaged engines, and readying the Thunderbolts for the next sortie. The pilots, meanwhile, trained harder than ever. Zemke's philosophy was simple: every mistake in training cost fuel, but every mistake in combat cost lives. He drilled his men relentlessly, formation flying, mock dogfights, gunnery exercises, until their reflexes became instinct. The Wolfpack's cohesion grew tighter with each mission. Gabreski, already one of the group's most aggressive hunters, was emerging as its ace of aces. He had the rare ability to stay calm in the heat of battle, to read the chaos around him and strike with precision. Zemke admired him but also warned him against recklessness. "Gabby," he would say, "don't fight the whole Luftwaffe alone." But Gabreski couldn't help it. Every time he climbed into his jug, he became a predator. Robert Johnson, too, was coming into his own. His quiet, deliberate style contrasted with Gabreski's boldness, but it was no less deadly. Johnson had a natural sense of timing, when to attack, when to break, when to survive. On one mission, his Thunderbolt was riddled with cannon fire from a Focke-Wulf. The cockpit filled with smoke, his control surfaces shredded, but somehow the massive aircraft stayed airborne. Johnson coaxed it back across the Channel, landing in England with over 200 bullet holes in the fuselage. When the crew chief counted them, even Zemke shook his head in disbelief. The jug had proven itself that day as more than just a fighter, it was a fortress. Stories like that spread quickly through the group and gave the men faith in their machines. The P-47 might not climb as fast as a 109 or turn as tight as a 190, but in a dive, it was a killer, and in toughness, it was unmatched. Zemke began using that to his advantage. He developed tactics built around slashing attacks from altitude, hit hard, hit fast, and never dogfight where the enemy had the edge. The Wolfpack learned to fight on their own terms, using the jug's strengths ruthlessly. As 1943 drew to a close, the 8th Air Force's daylight offensive intensified. The bombers were striking deeper into Germany, hitting factories, rail yards, and oil installations. Every mile deeper meant greater risk, and every escort mission became a race against fuel and time. The 56th was often tasked with the most dangerous sectors, sweeping ahead of the bomber stream or meeting the returning formations as they limped home. Their battles took them over Lille, Amiens, and Rouen, places etched into their memories by the fire and smoke of combat. Each engagement taught them more about their enemy. The Luftwaffe's tactics were still formidable. They attacked in coordinated waves, diving from the sun or climbing from below, firing heavy cannon shells that could tear a bomber apart with a single hit. But they were beginning to feel the strain. Fuel shortages, mechanical wear, and the relentless pace of Allied raids were eroding their efficiency. The Americans, meanwhile, were learning fast. The arrival of new Thunderbolt models with drop tanks extended their range, allowing the escorts to push farther east. The Wolfpack could now stay with the bombers longer, turning the tide in the deadly duel for control of the skies. By early 1944, the 56th had become a legend. Other units looked to them for guidance, copying their tactics and their discipline. Zemke's leadership was admired throughout the 8th Air Force. His insistence on teamwork and survival had saved countless lives. Yet for all their success, the toll was heavy. The constant strain of combat wore on every man. Sleep was scarce, nerves frayed, and letters home were often written between missions with hands that still trembled from adrenaline. The winter weather added another layer of misery. Fog and freezing rain grounded operations for days at a time, turning the airfields into quagmires of mud. But when the skies cleared, the missions resumed without pause. On one bitter January morning, the Wolfpack was ordered to escort bombers striking targets near Frankfurt. It was a long haul, at the edge of their range. Zemke led the group at high altitude, condensation trails stretching behind them like silver threads. Halfway to the target, they encountered a massive Luftwaffe interception force, dozens of Bf-109s and FW-190s climbing to meet them. The radio came alive with warnings, and Zemke immediately split his formation into smaller elements. The sky became a swirling chaos of vapor trails and gunfire. Gabreski dove through the melee, shooting down one 109 in a single pass before climbing again. Johnson scored another, his calm precision contrasting with the frenzy around him. But the Germans were desperate. They attacked head-on, determined to break through to the bombers. Zemke coordinated his units like a conductor directing an orchestra, positioning them to strike the enemy flanks. The Thunderbolts dived in pairs, guns blazing, ripping into the climbing 109s. The sheer firepower of the Jugs was overwhelming. Several Luftwaffe formations broke apart, scattering under the assault. Yet victory never came without loss. 2 of Zemke's pilots failed to return that day, their fates unknown. When the group landed back in England, the mood was subdued. They had downed more than 20 enemy fighters, but the empty chairs in the mess that evening were a stark reminder of the cost. Still, the Wolfpack endured. Each battle forged them tighter, each loss steeled their resolve. The men of the 56th had stopped thinking of themselves as individuals. They were part of something larger now, a brotherhood bound by duty and survival. Zemke often reminded them that the goal was not glory or medals but mastery of the sky and of themselves. As winter gave way to spring, the stakes grew even higher. The invasion of Europe was approaching, and air superiority was no longer a goal, it was a necessity. Every mission flown by the 56th, every engagement, every kill, was part of the preparation for D-Day. The Luftwaffe had to be broken before the Allies could land in France. And so the Wolfpack flew, day after day, through exhaustion, fear, and the cold bite of high-altitude air, knowing that the fate of the coming invasion might depend on their success in the skies. By March of 1944, the men of Zemke's Wolfpack had become veterans in every sense of the word. They had survived the worst months of attrition and had turned their squadron into one of the most feared and efficient units in the 8th Air Force. Each mission honed their skills further, and every pilot who flew with them learned fast or not at all. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous, but the balance had begun to shift. Once, the German pilots had been the hunters, now, increasingly, they were the hunted. Zemke understood that success depended on constant adaptation. He studied enemy tactics obsessively, analyzing gun camera footage, interrogating returning pilots, and adjusting his methods accordingly. He emphasized the importance of altitude, speed, and teamwork above all else. The one who sees first, lives, he often reminded his men, drilling the lesson until it became reflex. His leadership was pragmatic but also deeply human. He cared about his pilots, not just as instruments of war but as young men far from home, enduring unimaginable stress. He made time to talk with them after missions, to listen, to joke when the mood allowed, and to ensure they never forgot why they were fighting. It was this balance of discipline and compassion that made the Wolfpack more than a unit, it made them a family. Their camaraderie was evident in the air and on the ground, in the quiet moments between missions when they played cards, shared stories, or simply sat in silence watching the English rain fall across the airfield. But there was little time for peace. The pace of operations was relentless. Every morning brought new targets, new briefings, new risks. The enemy was weakening, but a cornered animal fights hardest before it dies. The Luftwaffe's remaining Jagdgeschwader, including JG-2 and JG-26, were throwing everything they had into the defense of the Reich. Their pilots flew until exhaustion or death, often with barely trained replacements filling the gaps left by fallen veterans. The Americans could sense the desperation in the enemy's attacks. They were less coordinated now, more reckless, as if driven by sheer will rather than strategy. Yet even in decline, the German fighter force remained lethal. On one mission in April, Gabreski's flight encountered a swarm of FW-190s near the Belgian border. The initial pass was brutal, tracers sliced through the sky, one Thunderbolt went down trailing smoke, and Gabreski himself took hits to his wing. But he held steady, rolled inverted, and dove into the fray. In a single, fluid motion, he closed behind one of the 190s and opened fire, watching the rounds tear through its fuselage until the German aircraft exploded in a burst of flame. Moments later, he pulled out, climbed back into the fight, and scored another victory. By the end of the engagement, 3 German fighters were confirmed destroyed, and Gabreski had added to his growing tally. His reputation now matched that of the best Allied aces, and even the Germans knew his name. For the men who flew beside him, he was both an inspiration and a reminder of what experience and nerve could achieve. But no one in the 56th believed themselves invincible. Every pilot had seen how quickly a clear sky could turn into a storm of death. On May 8, Zemke himself led a deep escort mission toward Hanover. The Luftwaffe intercepted them in force, and the ensuing dogfight stretched across 20 miles of sky. Thunderbolts and Messerschmitts tangled in spiraling duels, engines screaming, guns flashing. Zemke shot down one 109 and damaged another, but his wingman was lost. When he returned to base, the elation of victory was tempered by silence. Each loss weighed heavily, but there was no time to mourn, the next mission was always waiting. The rhythm of war allowed no pause. As the spring of 1944 unfolded, the Allied air forces unleashed a campaign of destruction unprecedented in scale. The goal was total air supremacy in preparation for the invasion of Normandy. Rail yards, airfields, communication centers, nothing was spared. The 56th Fighter Group was at the forefront, flying multiple sorties per day, strafing ground targets, and hunting down anything that moved beneath them. The nature of their missions was changing. No longer just escorts, the Thunderbolts were now used aggressively as fighter bombers, striking targets of opportunity and crippling the German war machine from the air. Zemke adapted his tactics once again, training his men for low-level attacks and strafing runs, where precision and nerves of steel were essential. The danger was immense, flak batteries and small arms fire from the ground turned the skies into a curtain of lead. Many pilots described it as flying through hell itself. Yet the results were devastating for the enemy. Columns of trucks, locomotives, and airfields littered with burning aircraft testified to the Wolfpack's effectiveness. By May, the Luftwaffe's ability to operate in daylight over Western Europe was all but broken. Still, the men of the 56th knew the hardest days were yet to come. D-Day was approaching, though the exact date was known only to the highest command. The pilots trained for it in secret, rehearsing escort formations, close support roles, and rapid turnarounds. They understood that when the invasion came, the success of the troops on the beaches would depend in large part on their ability to keep the skies clear. Zemke drove his men harder than ever, but also prepared them mentally for what was to come. he told them bluntly that the coming weeks would test them beyond anything they had known. "You've got to fight smart," he said during one briefing. "Not brave, smart. Brave men die fast. Smart men win wars." Those words stuck with every pilot who heard them. And then, in early June, the waiting ended. Operation Overlord began. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the greatest armada in history crossed the English Channel. The Wolfpack was already in the air, flying cover over the invasion beaches. From their cockpits, the pilots could see the vast expanse of ships below, destroyers, landing craft, transports, stretching from horizon to horizon. The sight was awe-inspiring and humbling. But there was no time to marvel. Radar reports indicated scattered Luftwaffe formations trying to penetrate the Allied air umbrella. Zemke directed his squadrons to intercept. The encounters were brief and brutal. Outnumbered and outflown, the German aircraft that dared approach were cut down before they could reach the beaches. Throughout that day and the days that followed, the 56th flew continuous sorties, escorting transports, strafing enemy convoys, and patrolling the skies over Normandy. The air over France belonged to the Allies now, but it was not yet safe. Pockets of resistance remained, and flak continued to exact a price. On June 12, Gabreski's Thunderbolt was damaged during a strafing run, forcing him to make an emergency landing behind Allied lines. He was shaken but unhurt, back in the air within days. The pace was relentless, the fatigue overwhelming, yet the men pressed on, sustained by the knowledge that they were witnessing history in motion. By the end of June, the Luftwaffe was effectively shattered in the west. The Wolfpack had flown hundreds of sorties, destroyed scores of enemy aircraft, and contributed immeasurably to the success of the invasion. Zemke's leadership was recognized throughout the 8th Air Force, and his men revered him as both a strategist and a mentor. For all their victories, however, there was a sense among the pilots that something profound had changed. The war in the air was no longer about duels between aces or contests of skill. It had become a war of attrition, of endurance, of industrial might. The individual dogfights that once defined the struggle were giving way to vast, impersonal battles of machinery and numbers. Yet within that storm, the men of the 56th retained their spirit. They had faced the best the Luftwaffe had to offer and prevailed. They had lost friends, survived impossible odds, and written their names into the story of the air war over Europe. And as they looked toward the east, where the front lines were now pushing deeper into the continent, they knew their work was not yet done. For the Wolfpack, the hunt would continue until the enemy was broken completely and the skies of Europe were finally free. By the summer of 1944, the balance of power in the skies over Europe had shifted irreversibly. What began as a desperate struggle for survival in 1943 had become a relentless Allied advance into the heart of the Reich. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, stood at the forefront of that transformation, no longer merely defending the bombers but spearheading the offensive itself. With the beaches of Normandy secured and the Allied armies pushing inland, air superiority was now absolute. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Germany's war machine, was a shadow of its former self. Its great Jagdgeschwader, JG-2, JG-26, JG-54, were depleted, their ranks filled with inexperienced pilots who barely had time to master their machines before being thrown into battle. Yet even wounded, the Luftwaffe could still strike hard. Pockets of veteran flyers remained, men like Major Gerhard Barkhorn, Oberstleutnant Gunther Roll, and Oberst Adolf Gull, and aces whose skill and resolve made every encounter deadly. They fought now with the desperation of men defending their homeland, and the skies over Germany became an arena of fierce, unforgiving combat. For the men of the 56th, the missions grew longer and more complex. The arrival of the North American P-51 Mustang began to change the nature of air warfare. With its long range and excellent performance, the Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something the P-47 had never been able to do. Some in the 8th Air Force believed the Thunderbolt's days were numbered. But Zemke and his men proved them wrong. The Jug still had a place, particularly in low-level operations where its toughness and firepower made it supreme. The 56th adapted again, shifting between escort duties and ground attack missions as needed. Zemke himself, always the strategist, saw the Mustang not as a rival but as a tool, one that, combined with the Thunderbolt, could finally strangle the Luftwaffe completely. His focus remained on the men under his command. He knew that fatigue was taking a toll. Months of near-constant combat had worn even the strongest pilots thin. The strain was visible in their faces, in the quiet moments when they stared into their coffee before a dawn mission, lost in thought. Letters from home brought comfort and pain in equal measure. Yet despite it all, morale remained high. The Wolfpack's sense of identity, forged in the hardest days of the war, carried them through the grind. Their record spoke for itself: hundreds of enemy aircraft destroyed in the air and on the ground, countless bombers saved from interception, and a reputation that inspired every pilot in the 8th Air Force. It was around this time that fate caught up with some of its greatest figures. On July 20, 1944, Francis "Gabby's" Gabreski, by then the top American ace in the European theater with 28 victories, was forced down behind enemy lines after strafing an airfield in France. He evaded capture for several days but was eventually taken prisoner by the Germans and sent to Stalag Luftwaffe. His absence was felt deeply within the group. Gabreski had been more than just an ace, he was a symbol of what a Thunderbolt could do in the right hands. Zemke, while proud of his friend's achievements, mourned the loss of one of his best. Yet even that blow could not halt the momentum. The Wolfpack flew on, every mission bringing them closer to the enemy's heart. As Allied forces advanced across France and into Belgium, the Thunderbolts of the 56th operated from newly captured airfields, sometimes just days behind the front lines. Their role expanded to include armed reconnaissance, rail interdiction, and close air support. The pilots learned to read the battlefield below, to identify enemy armor and troop concentrations, and to strike with precision. They became the eyes and fists of the advancing Allied armies. Zemke, ever the innovator, introduced new tactics for these missions, emphasizing coordinated attacks and constant movement to avoid flak. He often led by example, flying sorties himself even when his staff urged him to rest. His leadership was both admired and feared. He demanded excellence and tolerated no complacency, but he never asked his men to do what he would not do himself. The results were undeniable. The Wolfpack's kill totals continued to climb, and their efficiency in ground attacks made them invaluable to the Allied command. Yet the dangers were greater than ever. The Germans, retreating but defiant, concentrated their anti-aircraft defenses around key positions. Flak batteries lined the railways and bridges, and every low-level mission risked disaster. The roar of 88mm guns became a familiar and hated sound. Many Thunderbolts returned to base riddled with holes, their undersides shredded, their pilots exhausted but alive. Others did not return at all. Each loss cut deep, but the war left little time to grieve. In September 1944, as the Allies pushed toward the German border, Zemke was reassigned to take command of the newly formed 479th Fighter Group, equipped with the P-51 Mustang. His departure from the 56th marked the end of an era. The Wolfpack he had built from raw recruits into an elite fighting force was now led by Colonel David Schilling, another original member of the group and one of its most skilled tacticians. Schilling continued Zemke's legacy with the same aggressive style and focus on discipline. Under his command, the 56th adapted yet again, taking on the increasingly critical task of striking at the crumbling remnants of the Luftwaffe and the German transport network. By now, the enemy's situation was desperate. Fuel shortages grounded many of their aircraft, and the few that took to the air often lacked experienced pilots. Yet even a wounded Luftwaffe could be deadly when cornered. One of the most dangerous threats came in the form of the new Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was faster than anything the Allies had ever faced, and could outclimb and outrun the Thunderbolt with ease. The first encounters with the jet were shocking. Pilots described it as like trying to fight a comet. Yet despite its speed, the Me-262 was vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Schilling's men quickly learned to patrol near German airfields, catching the jets as they climbed or descended. It was a dangerous tactic, often drawing heavy flak, but it worked. The Wolfpack added several jet kills to their growing tally, further cementing their reputation as masters of the European sky. Meanwhile, Zemke and Gabreski, now prisoners of war in separate camps, followed the conflict's final stages from behind barbed wire. Zemke, captured later in October after his Mustang was damaged and forced down, found himself in Stalag Luftwaffe alongside hundreds of Allied airmen, including Gabreski. Even in captivity, Zemke's leadership never faltered. He organized the prisoners, maintained discipline, and ensured that morale remained high. Those who were there later said that his calm authority gave them strength during the long, uncertain months before liberation. Back in England, the Wolfpack continued to fly and fight through the winter of 1944–45. The Battle of the Bulge brought new urgency to their missions. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes shocked the Allies, and the skies once again filled with combat. The Luftwaffe made one last, desperate effort to regain control. On January 1, 1945, they launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive low-level attack on Allied airfields in Western Europe. The assault caused heavy damage on the ground, but the cost to the Germans was catastrophic. Hundreds of their remaining fighters were destroyed, and the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a meaningful fighting force. The Wolfpack, though scattered and tired, survived the onslaught largely intact. They struck back with furious precision, hunting down retreating German formations and providing close support to the Allied armies breaking through the Ardennes. As winter faded and the Allies crossed the Rhine, the end of the war was finally in sight. For the men of the 56th, the journey had been long and brutal. From the cold airfields of England in 1943 to the frontline bases of Germany in 1945, they had lived through the evolution of the air war itself. They had begun as green pilots learning to survive and ended as seasoned veterans who had written a chapter of history in the sky. By March of 1945, the final act of the air war over Europe was unfolding. The once mighty Luftwaffe, which had dominated the skies in 1940 and 1941, was now shattered, its airfields bombed, its fuel stores empty, and its pilots dwindling. What remained of Germany's air defense fought with bravery but little hope, driven by duty and desperation. The men of the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, had become witnesses to the collapse of their old enemy. Every mission brought new evidence of the Reich's decay, columns of refugees clogging roads, trains abandoned on shattered tracks, and airfields littered with the wreckage of destroyed aircraft. Yet even in its death throes, the Luftwaffe could still lash out. Jet fighters like the Me-262 and rocket-powered Me-163 Comet appeared sporadically, striking with terrifying speed before vanishing into the clouds. The Wolfpack adapted to this new threat as they had to every challenge before, learning to anticipate the jets' patterns, ambush them near their bases, and strike while they were vulnerable. It was a grim but necessary work. By this point, the men of the 56th had long since stopped counting individual victories. What mattered was finishing the job. Colonel David Schilling, who had taken command after Zemke's departure, led with unrelenting focus. He was a natural successor, cool under pressure, fiercely loyal to his men, and every bit as skilled in the air as his predecessors. Under Schilling, the group's operations became a relentless hammering of the enemy's remaining infrastructure. They strafed locomotives, bridges, and convoys across Western Germany, ensuring that whatever resistance remained on the ground would be isolated and starved of supply. The P-47s, loaded with bombs and rockets, roared across the Rhine in waves, leaving trails of destruction behind them. These missions were perilous in ways the dogfights had not been. Anti-aircraft fire was everywhere, thick and deadly. Many pilots said they feared flak more than any enemy aircraft. The sky would turn black with bursts, and fragments would tear through wings and canopies. Yet they pressed on, driven by duty and by the knowledge that the end was finally near. On the ground, Allied forces surged eastward, crossing the Rhine and advancing deep into Germany. The coordination between air and ground had reached a level of perfection unimaginable just 2 years earlier. The Wolfpack flew almost in tandem with the advancing armies, striking enemy positions ahead of the front lines and clearing the skies for reconnaissance and transport aircraft. The speed of the Allied advance often left them without time to rest. They would land, refuel, and take off again within hours. The men were exhausted, their faces hollowed by months of relentless combat, but their spirits remained unbroken. They had been forged by the war into something elemental, professionals to the core, bound together by shared struggle and sacrifice. As April began, the signs of victory were unmistakable. The German resistance was crumbling. Air opposition had become sporadic, and many Luftwaffe units were surrendering or destroying their aircraft to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. Still, some fought on with fatalistic determination. On April 7th, one of the last major air battles over Germany took place near Kassel, where remnants of JG-7 flying Me-262s attempted to intercept American bombers. The Wolfpack and other escort groups pounced. Though the jets were faster, their pilots were inexperienced and outnumbered. The result was a massacre, several Me-262s shot down, the rest scattering into the haze. It was the symbolic end of the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. In the following weeks, the mission shifted almost entirely to ground attack. The Thunderbolts ranged across Germany, hunting anything that moved: trains, convoys, artillery columns. They were the sword clearing the path for the Allied advance to Berlin. Many pilots who had once thrilled at aerial duels now found little joy in the work. The exhilaration of combat had been replaced by a grim sense of inevitability. They were executing the final blows of a war that had already taken too much from everyone. In early May, the news they had long awaited finally came. Germany had surrendered. The radio broadcasts carried the announcement across every airfield in Europe: the war in Europe was over. For a moment, no one quite believed it. The men of the 56th stood in silence, the sound of engines replaced by birds and wind. Some laughed, some wept, and some simply sat staring at the sky, as if unable to comprehend that it no longer belonged to war. The victory they had fought for, bled for, and survived for was finally theirs. But joy was tempered by memory. They thought of the friends who had not lived to see this day, of Gabreski still in captivity, of those who had gone down in flames over France or the Channel, of the countless empty bunks in the barracks. Their absence was the quiet shadow behind every celebration. When the prisoners of war were finally liberated, Zemke and Gabreski among them, the reunion was emotional. They returned not as conquerors but as men who had endured. Zemke, thin from months in captivity but unbowed, visited his old unit. The Wolfpack welcomed him as a hero, though he refused the title. He praised Schilling's leadership, spoke proudly of what his men had achieved, and reminded them that history would remember not just their victories but the discipline and integrity with which they fought. Gabreski, too, rejoined his comrades, his humor and confidence undiminished. In time, both would go on to distinguished post-war careers, continuing to shape the new US Air Force that emerged from the ashes of the war. For the 56th, the end of hostilities brought a strange quiet. The airfields that had once thundered with the sound of engines now lay still. Maintenance crews began dismantling equipment, pilots prepared for reassignment or discharge, and the once constant tension of combat gave way to reflection. In just over 2 years, the Wolfpack had flown more than 16,000 sorties, destroyed over 1,000 enemy aircraft, and established a combat record that would stand unmatched among 8th Air Force fighter groups. They had faced the best the Luftwaffe could offer, men like Egon Meyer, Joseph Priller, and countless others, and emerged victorious through skill, discipline, and sheer will. The lessons learned by Zemke and his men would shape air combat doctrine for generations. Their emphasis on teamwork, altitude advantage, and tactical flexibility became the foundation of modern fighter tactics. But beyond statistics and strategy, the legacy of Zemke's Wolfpack was something deeper, a story of endurance, brotherhood, and transformation. They had entered the war as young men, many barely out of flight school, and emerged as legends. The P-47 Thunderbolt, their faithful companion through every mission, became a symbol of that journey, rugged, powerful, indomitable. Long after newer, faster aircraft replaced it, veterans would still speak of the Jug with affection, remembering its roar, its strength, and the way it had carried them home when all seemed lost. When peace finally settled over Europe, the surviving members of the 56th scattered to new lives, some stayed in the service, others returned to farms, factories, and families. But wherever they went, they carried the bond of the Wolfpack with them. In reunions and letters, they kept the memory alive of Zemke's leadership, of Schilling's precision, of Gabreski's daring, and of all the men who had made the name Wolfpack synonymous with courage in the skies. History would remember them as warriors who helped turn the tide of the war, but among themselves, they remembered simply as brothers. And so, as the years passed and the roar of the Thunderbolt faded into history, the legend of Zemke's Wolfpack endured, a testament to what determination, discipline, and unity could achieve even in the darkest of times, and a reminder that in the boundless, perilous expanse of the wartime sky, courage was the only compass that never failed. The guns had fallen silent, but the legacy of Zemke's Wolfpack was only beginning, carried not in the echo of their engines but in the minds and methods of those who would shape the air wars to come. When the men of the 56th Fighter Group returned to America, they did so not as restless heroes looking for parades, but as craftsmen of a deadly trade who understood that the future of air combat would depend on what they had learned above Europe. Hubert Zemke himself, leaner from captivity yet as sharp as ever, re-entered the new United States Air Force as it was born in 1947, bringing with him the discipline, tactical precision, and leadership philosophy that had made his Wolfpack legendary. He commanded the 479th Fighter Group and later held senior posts within the growing network of NATO air commands, teaching a new generation of jet pilots that air combat, no matter how fast or complex, still depended on the same principles of energy, altitude, teamwork, and will. Zemke often told young officers that machinery changed, but the human element never did. Courage and judgment could not be built in factories. David Schilling followed a similar path, helping to pioneer long-range jet operations during the earliest days of the Cold War. A born innovator, Schilling became one of the first to push the limits of aerial refueling, leading transatlantic jet flights that proved American air power could reach anywhere on Earth. Tragically, his daring spirit outpaced his luck. In 1956, while still serving as a colonel, Schilling was killed in a car accident in England. His loss was felt across the Air Force, for he had become one of the bridges between the Thunderbolt age and the supersonic frontier. Francis Gabriel Gabreski, meanwhile, returned to combat once more, this time over Korea, where he added 6.5 MiG-15 kills to his already extraordinary World War II record. He flew the F-86 Sabre with the same aggressive style that had defined his days in the JUG, teaching younger pilots that instinct and audacity still mattered in the jet era. By the time he retired in 1967 as a colonel, Gabreski had become one of America's top fighter aces across 2 wars, a living testament to the continuity of the fighter pilot's art. Around them, the doctrine and identity that Zemke's Wolfpack had forged in the skies over Europe seeped into every corner of the post-war Air Force. The 56th itself was reactivated as a jet fighter wing, trading the roar of the P-47 for the shriek of the F-86 and later the F-100 Super Sabre, but its spirit remained unchanged. Pilots who joined the unit in the 1950s still spoke of the Wolfpack with reverence, learning not only its history but its philosophy, that air superiority was never a given, that discipline was the edge that turned survival into victory. The lineage of the group became a living tradition, its name carried forward through reorganizations, redesignations, and the endless evolution of machines. Zemke's emphasis on formation integrity and coordinated aggression appeared in the official fighter tactics manuals of the early jet age. The energy maneuverability theory that later defined aerial combat was rooted in the very principles he had drilled into his Thunderbolt pilots in 1943. Even as radar, missiles, and supersonic speeds transformed the battlefield, the essence of the Wolfpack remained visible in the way fighter squadrons trained, flight leads thinking not as lone hunters but as part of a pack, always aware of mutual support, communication, and tactical geometry. In the halls of the Air University at Maxwell Field, instructors cited Zemke and his men as exemplars of adaptive command. They showed how a unit that began with an ungainly, underperforming fighter had turned it into a weapon of domination through ingenuity and morale. To the young jet pilots of the 1950s and 1960s, these stories were more than history, they were instruction. The Wolfpack's experience taught them that no aircraft, however advanced, could win without disciplined teamwork. As the Cold War deepened and American pilots faced their Soviet counterparts in distant skies, from the frozen frontiers of Europe to the mountains of Korea, the echoes of the 56th's ethos could be heard in every briefing room. Their legacy was written not just in victories but in procedures, slogans, and unspoken habits that persisted across generations. The unofficial motto that had once circulated among Zemke's men, "Stay high, stay fast, stay alive," found its way into new contexts, etched in manuals and painted on hangar walls. To outsiders, it was a phrase about tactics. To those who had inherited the Wolfpack's bloodline, it was a way of thinking about life itself. As the decades passed and the thunder of jet engines replaced the growl of propellers, the Wolfpack's bloodline continued to evolve, not merely as a name painted on aircraft but as a living philosophy carried by those who flew in its shadow. In 1955, the 56th Fighter Group became the 56th Fighter Wing, and from the cold runways of England to the new airbases of the American West, it stood as a bridge between eras, linking the pilots of the Second World War to the guardians of the nuclear age. The aircraft changed: F-100s, F-105s, F for Phantoms, each faster, deadlier, and more complex than the last, yet every pilot who joined the wing learned the story of Zemke's Wolfpack. It was not presented as nostalgia but as instruction, the tale of how courage, teamwork, and adaptation had triumphed over superior numbers and daunting odds. During the Vietnam War, when American fighter pilots once again faced deadly adversaries in the skies, they rediscovered truths that Zemke and his men had already written in blood above Europe. The Wolfpack's tactical DNA, preserved through decades of training, re-emerged in the form of energy fighting, coordinated attacks, and the belief that initiative belonged to those who seized it first. Veterans of the 56th who flew over Southeast Asia often remarked that they could feel the presence of their predecessors, as if the ghosts of Thunderbolts were guiding them through the chaos of missile trails and cannon fire. By the 1970s, the name Wolfpack had become mythic within the Air Force, synonymous with aggressive excellence. The 56th Tactical Fighter Wing, based at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, became one of the premier training units of the jet age, responsible for shaping generations of fighter pilots. The instructors there spoke of Zemke's leadership as if he were still in the next room, reminding them that skill without integrity was meaningless, and that a true pilot was measured not only by kills or hours but by how he led and protected his wingmen. Even as technology transformed the art of air combat, from radar-guided missiles to computerized flight systems, the human element that Zemke had championed remained the heart of the Wolfpack's identity. When the sleek F-16 Fighting Falcon entered service in the late 1970s, the 56th was among the first to fly it, and the pilots quickly found in the agile jet a spiritual successor to the Thunderbolt: fast, sturdy, versatile, capable of delivering precision strikes yet still nimble enough to duel. They treated it not merely as a machine but as a companion, much as their forebears had treated the Jug. And just like the men of 1943, they trained in tight formations, drilled in energy discipline, and trusted each other implicitly in combat. The continuity was not coincidence, it was design, passed down through doctrine, mentorship, and the quiet reverence that linked one generation to the next. When Colonel Zemke passed away in 1994, tributes poured in from every corner of the Air Force. At Luke Air Force Base, where the 56th Fighter Wing was then stationed, pilots flew missing man formations in his honor. Many had never met him, yet all felt his influence in the way they fought, flew, and thought. To them, Zemke was not a relic of history but a voice still whispering across the radio net, urging calm under pressure, aggression when opportunity appeared, and discipline always. In the years that followed, the Wolfpack's name continued to echo through the ranks, from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan. Modern pilots flying the F-15 and F-16 still studied after-action reports from the 1940s, tracing patterns of decision and response that had not aged a day. Even in the age of stealth and satellites, the lessons remain timeless: altitude, energy, teamwork, and the unbreakable bond between those who share the sky. Today, the 56th Fighter Wing stands as one of the largest and most advanced training wings in the world, preparing pilots for the F-35 Lightning II, the fifth-generation successor to the lineage that began with the Jug. In the roar of that futuristic engine, in the calm intensity of the men and women who fly it, the spirit of Zemke's Wolfpack endures, not as nostalgia, but as a living creed. It is said that when a new pilot takes his first solo flight in an F-35 at Luke, he is told a story that begins not with silicon or stealth, but with a muddy English airfield in 1943, where a group of young Americans learned to fight, survive, and trust one another against impossible odds. The machines may have changed beyond recognition, but the essence of what they do, the brotherhood, the courage, the calm in the face of chaos, remains untouched. For as long as there are fighter pilots who look to the horizon and feel the call of the sky, Zemke's Wolfpack will live on, unseen but ever present, a ghost formation flying just above the clouds, reminding those below that courage, discipline, and unity are the only wings that never grow old. And in that unseen formation, forever circling above history's horizon, the Wolfpack remained, its roar now an echo woven into the sky itself. The years rolled on and the world changed beyond recognition, yet their story endured, told and retold in ready rooms, in hangars, and in the quiet corners of museums where the scent of oil and aluminum still hung in the air. Young pilots would stand before the silver curve of a P-47's fuselage and run a hand along its cold skin, feeling the weight of the names painted beneath the canopy: Zemke, Schilling, Gabreski, Johnson, and dozens of others whose courage had written the first lines of modern air combat. For them, the Wolfpack was not only a chapter in a book, it was a set of instructions written in sweat and fuel, a manual on how to be brave when the sky itself tried to kill you. Veterans who lived long enough to see the jet age unfold would sometimes visit those new bases and smile at the sight of aircraft far sleeker than anything they had known, their wings sharp as blades, their engines howling with power that would have seemed like sorcery in 1943. Yet, as they watched the new generation strap in, check their instruments, and taxi toward the runway, they recognized the same ritual movements, the same mixture of tension and calm before the takeoff roll, and they understood that the essence of their profession had never changed. War had moved on to new technologies, but courage remained analog, measured heartbeat by heartbeat. At reunions, held every few years as the ranks thinned, the surviving members of the Wolfpack would gather in hotel ballrooms or hangars decorated with faded flags. They would tell the old stories again, how Schilling once led a mission through weather so bad it seemed the sky itself was at war, or how Gabreski's laughter could cut through even the worst fear before a sortie. Some nights they talked deep into the early hours, their memories overlapping until past and present became one. They spoke of those who had not come home, and for a moment it was as if the lost were there again, standing just at the edge of the light, smiling quietly. The younger officers who attended those reunions listened in silence, realizing that what they were hearing was not just history but inheritance. When the last of the original Wolfpack passed into memory, their example remained, engraved in the DNA of every fighter squadron that valued precision over pride and discipline over impulse. The jets that streaked across the skies of the late 20th century, F-15s, F-16s, F-22s, all carried in their design and doctrine traces of the lessons first learned over occupied Europe. Engineers could calculate thrust and drag, but they could not design the moral geometry of a dogfight. That knowledge came only from men who had lived it. So even as satellites mapped the world and computers began to make decisions in milliseconds, somewhere in the background of every briefing there was still a photograph of Zemke, arms folded, eyes hard with purpose, a reminder that machines were only as great as the people who flew them. The Wolfpack's legend also outgrew the boundaries of its own nation. In Germany, where once the Black Crosses had risen to meet them, Luftwaffe historians came to regard Zemke's men with respect, even admiration, as worthy opponents who had fought honorably and well. At commemorations on old airfields, German veterans would sometimes stand alongside Americans, the enmity replaced by understanding that only those who had lived the same terror of fire and altitude could truly comprehend. The sky had been their shared battlefield, but also their shared home. In that strange fraternity of airmen, shaped by risk and sacrifice, the Wolfpack's story became a bridge between former enemies. And so, as decades faded into centuries, their memory settled into something larger than national pride. It became a story of what human beings could achieve when they refused to yield to fear. Time itself seemed to bow around their memory, the way sound bends around a steady note that never quite fades. The world of flight had transformed beyond recognition. Men now rode rockets past the edge of the atmosphere, drones crossed oceans without pilots aboard, and satellites traced invisible orbits far above the reach of any piston engine. Yet in the lore of every aviator, in the lineage of every squadron patch and call sign, the Wolfpack still flew. Zemke's philosophy, precision, restraint, teamwork, became the unwritten creed of the modern fighter pilot. In every air force that studied the old campaigns, instructors pointed to those 56th Fighter Group records and said, "This is what discipline looks like under fire." Zemke himself would live long enough to see the jet age take shape, his grey hair a quiet testament to the wars he had outlasted. He commanded the 479th Fighter Group, then served through the birth of NATO, shaping new generations who had never heard a propeller's roar. Schilling, restless as ever, carried his instinct for leadership into the new Air Force, helping forge its identity in a world balanced uneasily between peace and annihilation. Gabreski flew again in Korea, carving his name into history's ledger a second time, proving that courage was not bound to one war alone. And Johnson, the brawler of the skies, lived his life with the same fire he had shown over Europe, always loyal to the memory of his comrades. Each man carried the weight of survival differently, yet together they embodied the strange peace that follows victory, a peace filled with ghosts and gratitude. As they aged, they spoke less of kills and sorties and more of the moments between them, the silence before takeoff, the way sunlight hit the canopy just before a fight, the strange calm that came when a man accepted that the next breath might be his last. Those who knew them later in life said that their eyes still searched the horizon unconsciously, as if expecting to see a contrail, a flash of sunlight, a phantom wingman holding formation. The wolf pack had become more than a unit, it was an idea, a living constellation mapped across time. When the last of them passed, their funerals were attended by men and women who had never met them, yet felt they owed them something, a posture, a principle, a piece of courage borrowed from history. At airshows, the rumble of a restored P-47 Thunderbolt sometimes rolled across the fields, its engine coughing to life like an old heart remembering its rhythm. Children would cover their ears, and the veterans would smile, tears hidden behind sunglasses. In that noise, they heard everything, the youth they'd lost, the friends they'd buried, the world they'd saved, the price they'd paid. And as the big fighter lifted into the blue, heavy and defiant, its shadow swept across the crowd like the wing of a legend that refused to die. Even the earth itself seemed to hold traces of them. In England, wild grass grew over the old runways at Halesworth and Boxted, but when the wind passed through, it made a sound like distant engines, the faintest whisper of the days when hundreds of Thunderbolts clawed for altitude over Suffolk. Locals still found bits of aluminum in the soil, fragments of cowling, rivets, the occasional bullet casing, relics of a time when the sky was war's true frontier. Visitors left small tokens at the memorials, a pair of dog tags, a faded squadron patch, a note folded beneath a stone. Some nights, when the weather turned and fog lay heavy over the fields, it was said that the air felt charged, as if memory itself had mass, and the faintest outline of wings might be seen gliding above the mist. Perhaps that was only imagination, or perhaps history never truly leaves the places where it was written. The Wolfpack's story had become inseparable from the air that carried it. In the language of pilots, they had reached wheels up forever, their departure permanent but their presence enduring. And so the narration of their legend now belongs to the living. Each time a pilot checks his oxygen line, each time a crew chief runs a hand along a wing before dawn, each time a student of history reads the name Zemke or Gabreski or Schilling, the formation reforms for a moment, unseen but felt, vast but intimate. They remind us that valor is not born from invincibility, but from resolve, that mastery of the air begins first with mastery of the self. When the sun sets behind a flight line and the last aircraft of the day rolls to a stop, the wind carries a note from another century, a soundless salute to those who flew when the odds were longest. Somewhere beyond sight, the Wolfpack still flies, its engines a harmony of courage and memory, tracing a circle that has no end. The sky holds their story now, quiet, eternal, endless as flight itself.